Welcome to our very special autumn local mini-conference entitled Lawrencian Spirituality from this very beautiful and important church, Greasley St Mary's. Centred in Lawrence's country of my heart, a church known and loved by Lawrence, surrounded by the most exquisite countryside, that land that inspired so much of his early writing. He describes so much flora and fauna with eloquence and precision in The White Peacock, and of course, Sons of Lovers, Paul and Miriam, Lawrence and Jesse Chambers. It was their land, their inspiration. And it's ours too. Unlike Eastwood, which is nothing like the photos during Lawrence's time, this bit of countryside is truly representative of what Lawrence describes in so many of his works. This church, originally medieval, suffered serious subsidence in the 19th century, resulting in all the main body of the church caving in, leaving just the tower at the west end. But thanks to the generosity of the Barber family, it was completely restored in line with the Gothic originals, something that the Victorians did well. And what we have today is this superb building surrounded by green fields. And what is more, as Denise was just saying to us, the careful links we have now developed in the last two festivals and a resurgence of other local events. It's now unofficially adopted as D.H. Lawrence's church shrine, if you like, surrounded by history and so many D.H. Lawrence connections. So it gives me great pleasure to bring to you a live stream broadcast to all our global members now, thanks to our superb technician, Bob, who's enabled this, and of course to all of you who've turned up this afternoon. And a big thank you, of course, to Denise and the church for allowing us to use it. The publicity that has gone out, Lawrencian Spirituality, what did Lawrence actually believe? Does his voice speak to faith today? And I use the word spirituality rather than religion, as I wanted to widen it to be inclusive to a 21st century diverse community. One can be spiritual without being religious, and I am conscious that people joining us will be from all walks of life, multi-faith, believers and non-believers. But what we all have in common is that we value life, we seek good, we bond through love, and in this precarious, frightening world, we value life, our fragile creation, through our faith, whether it is humanist, whether it's deity, cosmic. It's peace that we strive for, and our dear planet that we care for, its preservation. And so much is going on at the moment, and that's nothing new. Go back 100 years, and Lawrence was dealing with all sorts of things. As far as religion was concerned, and that is the area we're looking today, he was far ahead of his time. Controversial? Yes. Argumentative? Yes. Provoking? Yes. A believer? Well, yes. No. Yes. No. Yes, but not conforming to what most people of the time thought of God, Jesus, Christianity and faith. Was Lawrence a spiritual person? I believe he was, but we can develop that. He was searching for that existence beyond superficiality, greed. And then when we come to the late poems, that word oblivion comes back time and time again. I will come more into that when I do my talk at the end. But now let's look at his life story, his background, all that channeled into that great thinking mind, those iconic writings, the great novels, the essays and the poetry. We have two experts here. Where are they? Yes, there's John and there's Tony, who are going to take two aspects. First of all, Tony, the title of your talk is Questions Which Will Not Be Answered, Lawrence and Christianity. And we look at Lawrence's rejection of dogma, his up and down, his own interpretations and all sorts of things connected from the Christian angle. And then John is going to look at how other faiths and rituals, and Native American influence, the Mexican religion, and all that shaped his own spiritual outlook. And that's called There Are Many Ways to Look at the World, Lawrence and the Two-Eyed Seeing. And then I'll come back on the scene to ask whether to us, in a 21st century, multi-faith, global, inclusive society, does all this have any relevance to us in our own spiritual journeys? So, first of all, let's welcome Anthony.
Thank you, Alan, and I'd like to add my own thanks to the church here for hosting us. I can't think of a more suitable venue for us to be discussing this particular wide-ranging subject. So, questions which will not be answered: Lawrence and Christianity. In December 1907, the 22-year-old Lawrence wrote to his local minister, the Reverend Robert Reed of Eastwood Congregational Church. One of the things he says in what is a wide-ranging and very important letter, which in many ways marks the beginnings of Lawrence's own religious and spiritual explorations, is this: a man gradually formulates his own religion, be it what it may. A man has no religion who has not slowly and painfully gathered one together, adding to it, shaping it. And one's religion is never complete and final, it seems, but must always be undergoing modification. Lawrence's making of his own personal religion, his spirituality, initially involved a reckoning with the Christian faith he had inherited from his family and from the church in Eastwood. A reckoning with the faith in terms of what he could still believe of it and take away from it, in the light of his own life experience and of his growing experience of the world around him. First of all, in terms of his own life experience, a young person growing up in the church, one thing was that he found that he lacked a classic, as it were, conversion experience, which was understood to be the entry point to the Christian life. He says in this letter, "I've been brought up to believe in the absolute necessity for a sudden spiritual conversion. I believed for many years that the Holy Ghost descended and took conscious possession of the elect, the converted one. I thought all conversions were, to a greater or less degree, like that of St. Paul in the book of Acts, the literal Damascus Road moment where he sees Christ in light and is instantly changed. Naturally, said Lawrence, I yearned for the same, something of the same. St. Paul's experience was seen as the model of conversion, how conversion happens. But Lawrence found himself unable to understand what it meant in real practical terms of experience to give oneself to God as a part of this. Through all that time, he says, I was constantly making the appeals we in the church are urged to make, constantly bewildering myself as to what I should surrender. Give yourself, you say. I was constantly endeavouring to give myself, but, sir, to this day, I do not understand what this giving consists in, embodies, and includes. Now, this is Lawrence writing at the age of 22, so he's writing about an inner struggle and confusion over a number of years, even as a church member. One thing that came to mind when I was thinking about this, and I wouldn't want to compare the two very closely, but Lawrence's experience does remind me somewhat of the young Martin Luther, who as a young man would constantly fret over whether he had repented enough of his sins. He knew you had to repent. He knew that was part of the process. But his constant thought was, have I repented enough? And Lawrence's struggle was not unlike this, his confusion as to what should happen and for him why it hadn't happened. And this made me wonder, is it possible that churches and other faith groups can inadvertently cause people difficulties in coming to faith by prescribing too closely the kind of experience which they must have? Is there indeed one felt experience which definitely happens to all people who come to faith? This isn't to doubt the reality of the spectacular and sudden experiences of faith and encounter with God, which some people do have. But then again, experience is a very personal thing, to be appreciated and cherished by each person, rather than measured against someone else's. I can remember one of the leaders of a personal evangelism training program in the 1980s, stating during one of the sessions that he couldn't point to a specific moment in his life when he knew that he suddenly was a Christian. He'd become a Christian there and then. For him, his experience had been more of a growth in a faith that he'd always been somehow aware of. But yet there he was, living the faith, wanting to share it and wanting to help others to do the same. But such was the model of Christian experience that Lawrence had known and that many people still know today. But all that he found in seeking such a definite moment of encounter with the divine was a time of intense emotion which then died away without great result, he says. Sunday night happened, but then it was Monday morning and Tuesday, and things faded again back to normality. Something else that demonstrates is how people's religious and spiritual experience centres not so much just on what they're taught, but how they understand what they're taught. It's not just a matter of what the preacher or teacher says from the pulpit, but what the congregation hears that matters. It's not just what I say, but how you pick it up, how you understand it, because your understanding is what you will base your thinking and your acting upon. It seems that this had been the case for Lawrence, as it was and still often is for many people. And becoming unconvinced by talk of just having to wait for God's good timing, Lawrence came to believe, as he says, that a man is converted when he first hears the low, vast murmur of life, of human life, troubling his hitherto unconscious self. I believe, he says, that a man is born first unto himself, for the happy developing of himself while the world is a nursery, and the pretty things are to be snatched for. Some people seem to exist thus right to the end. But most, Lawrence says, are born again on entering manhood. They are born to humanity, to a consciousness of all the laughing and the never-ceasing murmur of pain and sorrow that comes from the terrible multitudes of brothers. So still this sense that, yes, a person is born again in sort of classic Christian and biblical language. But what does that mean? What is that? For Lawrence, he's framing it by now in early adulthood, in his understanding, as an experience which sounds more like adolescence in general, just growing up, growing into the world, away from the nursery and into the wider world. Lawrence here is, very interestingly, and we'll see this again, he's doing his theology and his idea of the Christian life from the ground up, as it were. He starts out by asking not what is God like and what does he do and say, but he's asking what is it like to be a living, growing person in the world, and how does this shape our view and our understanding of the world, both the world that we can see and the cosmic, eternal world. So partly rooted in Lawrence's experience was his understanding of these things. And for Lawrence, a growing awareness of the world included a growing awareness of its problems. And here we come to the second aspect of his reckoning with Christian faith. he writes to the Reverend Reed of the old doubts which arise on seeing the suffering in the world in the face of belief in a loving God. He remembers going through the Sneinton area of Nottingham and seeing the poverty and degradation that was there at the time, and feeling this to be, as he says, not compatible with the idea of an all-powerful, pitying God. He even says in the letter, "It cannot be, I said to myself, that a pitiful, omnipotent Christ died 1900 years ago to save these people from this, and yet here they are." If God was able to touch the hearts of people as Lawrence had been taught, then why did he not touch these people at once and save this enormity, this horror? It was taught, Lawrence continues, that God's ways are unknowable to us and that we needed faith. But if faith was a belief in an unprovable hypothesis, there must be, Lawrence thought, at least a harmony of facts before a hypothesis can be made. And the two facts of, on the one hand, an all-powerful, loving God, and on the other, the enormous suffering in the world, these could not be brought into harmony together, to work with together. It was one or the other. Lawrence's concern with the question of how God can allow suffering is one which has been raised throughout history, of course, both in the church and in pre-Christian times, in the Bible back to the book of Job, but also in other ancient literature, and certainly onwards into our own day. As long as there have been people, there has been this question. John Hick, in his book Evil and the God of Love, examines the ways in which theologians and philosophers have grappled with the question since the early days of the church. For Lawrence, this certainly formed another important aspect of his youthful struggles with Christian faith. He could accept what he calls a harmony of design on the cosmic level, therefore a cosmic God, as he says in the letter, a God over all things. But in the world he saw only impersonal causes and effects in the sufferings of people, not the workings of a personal human God. People are destroyed, people suffer disease. Lawrence, in the face of this, wrote that, "I do not wage war against Christianity. I do not hate it. But these questions will not be answered. And for the present, my religion is the lessening, in some pitiful moiety, some very small amount, the great human discrepancies, the great inconsistencies and injustices that there are in the world." He was arriving at a state of belief which didn't seek anymore to reconcile what he saw as the all-powerful loving God and the suffering of humanity. From here on, his task was not to justify the ways of God to man, like John Milton, but to understand man, to understand humanity, and to address its suffering. But one thing that we can say is that Lawrence was never a sort of hardcore atheist, such as, say, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris are, and other figures are today. Lawrence said he didn't wage war on Christianity, even when he no longer was able to accept its basic doctrines. But after meeting the philosopher Bernard Russell in 1915, Lawrence's reaction was that Russell will be so temporal, so immediate. He won't let go, he won't act in the eternal things when it comes to men and life. Russell to Lawrence was someone who was too much on working too much in the visible world, too much of basically a materialist thinker. There was more than that to Lawrence. You couldn't just work in terms of the here and now. There was something beyond. When I was preparing this talk, I commented to Alan that Lawrence would probably not have sided either with Richard Dawkins or with the Reverend Billy Graham if he'd met either or both of them. If he'd been in a room with both together, then he'd have been very much the third party. He'd probably say, "No, you're wrong on that and you're wrong on that." From Lawrence's later life, his poem "There Are No Gods" was found in a notebook from the late 1920s. And as his young person's letter to Robert Reed when he was 22 sort of sets the foundation that he would move from, the sort of basis that he was thinking on from there on. So this late poem, I was going to say affirms his position, but in some ways it's not a position that is easy to affirm. He's simply showing us sort of where he is in later life as well as in early. Yes, this poem, "There Are No Gods," was found in a late 1920s notebook. And it goes some way to illustrate how he was still thinking. His view of God, rather his sense of God, and of something beyond the life of the visible. It's perhaps ironic, given its title, as we will see, to say that there are no gods when we see what the poem actually says, but here are some extracts. "There are no gods, and you can please yourself. Have a game of tennis, go out in the car, do some shopping, sit and talk, with a cigarette browning your fingers. There are no gods, and you can please yourself. Go and please yourself. But leave me alone to myself. And then, in the room, whose is the presence that makes the air so still and lovely to me? Who is it that softly touches the sides of my breast and touches me over the heart so that my heart beats soothed and at peace? I tell you, it is no woman, it is no man, for I am alone. And I fall asleep with the gods that are not or that are, according to the soul's desire, like a pool into which we plunge or do not plunge." This late poem suggests that Lawrence is in some kind of space between out-and-out atheism and formal religious belief. A sense that there is something there around him when he is alone, something which he knows but cannot name, but feels nonetheless real for being unknowable and undescribable. Notice there's not a sense of sort of God with a capital here, not a God you can speak with as in prayer, one being to another. There's no speech here, no words in the encounter, simply presence. Lawrence isn't like the young Samuel in the Old Testament saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears," and waiting to hear something. He knows simply that something is there. But it's interesting that the question he puts here is, whose is the presence? Who is here with me? Not what is here, but who. So there's a suggestion of something personal here. Many people today have a similar sense of something else in life, something else around them beyond the visible. They usually aren't believers in orthodox religious creeds, but just have an awareness, a sense of something more than the material and the visible world they see around them. Many people have this feeling, or perhaps in our own time, just feel freer to say so. And the question that arises for people of faith in their churches and their other groups is whether to lead people away from this into religious certainty, or whether to walk with them in it and through it and say, yes, you've already got something there. Let's explore what this is and look into it and explore it further. Alan has already mentioned the kind of foundation that Lawrence was partly moving away from, partly building on in his thinking. As Alan said, biblical language and concepts were found in all of his writing, and he never seems to have been uncomfortable with this. His personal and his social culture were rooted partly in the church, where he had the Bible poured into him as a child. And he seems to have felt quite free in recognising this and drawing on it in his language, but without being bound by it. And yet he himself, as we've seen, had felt unable to enter into what he had been taught to assume had been vital Christian experience. Like so many people who move away from traditional Christian belief, the question to ask is where they go to from there. We can see Lawrence's beliefs as a journey throughout his life, just as his life was an actual journey, as we'll hear later on. And while this picture of life as a journey is getting a bit overused these days, it can still be revealing in some instances, certainly such as Lawrence's. His journey was from a traditional congregational upbringing and teaching in Eastwood, but one which in itself addressed the challenges of the time. Robert Reed, the minister, had preached sermons on subjects like science and evolution, partly in response to Lawrence's own questions. It may seem surprising to find a local minister in an average-sized town in the Midlands addressing big subjects like science and so on. But the Reverend Reed's sermons were, I believe, motivated by general pastoral care for his people. He wasn't sweeping these things under the carpet. And this was part of, although this didn't convince Lawrence to stay in the church, his wider reading did help him to start to formulate at least the kind of journey that he went on, if not the definite beliefs that he had. So from the church he moved on to a period of religious doubt, which is when the letter is from, at age about 20. Religious doubts following his reading of writers like Spencer and Darwin and others in science and theology during his young adult years and his time in teacher training. It's not uncommon for many young people to face the first challenge to their beliefs when they move into further and higher education. In his novel The Rainbow, in the chapter The Widening Circle, Ursula Brangwen feels herself liberated when into something as yet unknown but new, when she is introduced to science such as French, Latin and algebra. But at the same time, Lawrence carried with him the Christian culture in which he had been brought up. In his late essay, Hymns in a Man's Life, he admits that all of the poems he studied and learnt in adult life by great writers like Wordsworth, Keats and Shakespeare are, he says, still not so woven deep in me as the rather banal, nonconformist hymns that penetrated through my childhood. I think that many of us can attest to a similar feeling if we were brought up in a church environment, and many of us still know words that we learnt way back then, even if we haven't said or sung them in several decades. And it's interesting that Lawrence is able to recall these memories without shame, even as one who has renounced the major doctrines of the church. He still has a feeling for the aesthetics of the church he knew, the music and the words. It's part of his childhood and the making of him, and he can no more disown that than he would disown any other. But at the same time, Lawrence took the religious symbolism that he had known and that which he was to discover, and he wanted to find out what lay behind it, what needs were being expressed, what people were saying about their relationship to the world and to each other. I suspect that if we could meet Lawrence today, we might find him to be one of those rather insistent people who are always asking, yes, but why do we say that? Why do we do this? Why do you do that? In churches, there are sometimes individuals who always seem to want to go deeper into matter of faith than everyone else, who it seems can't just let things be at the level we already know and understand them. And while it's perhaps annoying, it's fair enough that some people should want to do that. One of the church fathers, either Augustine or Jerome, said of the Bible that it provides waters in which children may play and elephants may swim. And while the children will never, for their own safety, go as deep as the elephants. Sorry, that's a bit of science coming through there. They're both swimming in the same waters. The further question is what those who swim find in the water, if anything, and where they find the limits to how far they can go, that is, how far our human understanding will take us. So, Lawrence related to the church on an emotional level all his life as an integral part of his upbringing. Like so many people, he had a cultural background there, the language of the Bible and the hymn book, that late essay entitled Hymns in a Man's Life, written years and years after his initial experiences. And yet, all of this he had without any longer feeling bound to the church's core beliefs as literal truth. In terms of the latter, Lawrence went on exploring, looking for a religious system, or better, a way of life, which would express better the meanings, the realities of existence. This led to his exploration of other societies, as John will shortly be taking us through. Lawrence was not content to leave that gap which was created by the loss of his early faith unfilled. There was a gap, and he knew it. But neither did he want to fill that gap with any quick or easy answers. Thank you.
And so let's go straight into John Pateman.
Yes, good afternoon. Alan called me an expert. I'm not an expert on Lawrence. I'm learning. But I do have lived experience of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. And I think lived experience is a form of expertise. For 10 years, I was privileged to live in northwestern Ontario in Canada on the shores of Lake Superior. And Thunder Bay, the city of Thunder Bay where I lived, has the highest Indigenous per capita population in Canada. So lots of Indigenous people from the Anishinaabe community who I was privileged to work with. And I went to many of their events, their powwows, their various social events. And like Lawrence, I listened to their singing, I watched their dancing, I listened to the drumming. It didn't mean anything to me as a white Westerner, but I knew it meant something very powerful to the Indigenous people. And it was a very moving experience. And you could watch it through one eye as a white European, as a pure spectacle. The costumes, the dancing, they got bells on, a bit like Morris dancers. But if you watch the Indigenous people watching it, they weren't watching it as a spectacle. This was a religious event. This was a sacred ritual being played out. So this is the idea of two-eyed seeing. You can see something through both eyes at once and see something through the white eye and the Indigenous eye. Hence my title, There Are Many Ways to Look at the World, Lawrence and Two-Eyed Seeing. So Lawrence's view of the world, as Tony suggested, changed significantly after he moved to Southwest America, where he lived on and off between 1922 and 1925. The impact of this new world, because it wasn't new to the Indigenous people, on Lawrence was instant and dramatic. In his essay, Indians and an Englishman, he said, "I shall never forget that first evening when we first came into contact with red men. Something in my soul broke down, letting in a pungent awakening to the lost past. Every drop of me trembles still, alive to the old sound. Every thread in my body quivers to the frenzy of the old mystery." In a later essay, New Mexico, he said, "I think New Mexico was the greatest experience from the outside world that I've ever had. It certainly changed me forever. Curious as it may sound, it was New Mexico that liberated me from the present era of civilization, the great era of material and mechanical developments. His previous travels had not shattered the essential Christianity on which my character was established, he said. But New Mexico was different. The moment I saw the brilliant, proud morning sun shine high up over the deserts of Santa Fe desert, something stood still in my soul. A new part of the soul woke up suddenly, and the old world gave way to a new. In New Mexico, the heart is sacrificed to the sun, and the human being is left stark, heartless, but undauntedly religious. Lawrence had looked all over the world for something that would strike me as religious, he said. For example, he'd looked at the simple piety of some English people and the semi-pagan mystery of some Catholics in southern Italy, which had seemed religious, but it didn't involve me, he said. I looked on at their religiousness from the outside, for it is still harder to feel religion at will than to love at will. In Ceylon, while watching the so-called devil dances, Lawrence said he felt religion for a moment. For religion is an experience, an uncontrollable sensual experience, even more so than love. I use sensual to mean an experience deep down in the senses, inexplicable and inscrutable. But this experience was fleeting, and Lawrence had no permanent feeling of religion, he said, until he came to New Mexico and, I quote, penetrated into the old human race experience there. It was curious that it was in Native America, of all places, that Lawrence, a white European, should really experience religion and get a sense of living religion from the Red Indians. Lawrence was not concerned with the Indian as an American citizen. What concerns me, he said, is what he is, or what he seems to me to be in his ancient race self and religious self. The Indian, as a civilized and truly religious man, was religious in perhaps the oldest sense and deepest of the word, he said. That is to say, he is a remnant of the most deeply religious race still living. White America had tried to civilize New Mexico, but beneath this superficial veneer of Western civilization, there lies, he said, a tribal integrity and a living tradition going back far beyond the birth of Christ, beyond the pyramids, beyond Moses. A vast old religion which once swayed the earth lingers in unbroken practice there in New Mexico. It was here that he felt, I quote, the old root of human consciousness, still reaching down to depths we know nothing of. The Indians expressed their religion through dance, the ceaseless downward tread always to the earth's centre, and the singing of the men at the drum, the wonderful deep sound of men calling to the unspeakable depths. It was, he said, a vast old religion, greater than anything we know, more darkly and nakedly religious. There is no God, no conception of a God. All is God. But it is not the pantheism we are accustomed to, which expresses itself as God is everywhere, God is everything. In the oldest religion, everything was alive, not supernaturally, but naturally alive. There were only deeper and deeper streams of life, vibrations of life, more and more vast. So rocks and mountains were alive, for the whole life effort of a man was to get his life into direct contact with the elemental life of the cosmos, mountain life, cloud life, thunder life, air life, earth life, sun life. To come into immediate felt contact and so derive energy, power, and a dark sort of joy. This effort into sheer naked contact without an intermediary or mediator is the real meaning of religion, he said. It was a vast and pure religion without idols or images, even mental ones. It is the oldest religion, a cosmic religion, the same for all peoples, not broken up into specific gods or saviors or systems. It is a religion which precedes the God concept and is therefore greater than any God religion. Lawrence foresees a new world deriving from indigenous America, the authentic America, New Mexico's America, that can render the skyscraper obsolete. Once the oldest religion has been ousted by the newest democracy, then the democracy and all its paraphernalia will collapse, he said, and the oldest religion will start again. The genuine America, the America of New Mexico, will start on its course again. This is an interregnum. Lawrence was referring to a belief system that was much older than Western religions. He was talking about a view of the world that existed long before Christianity or other codified religions that were written down in the Bible or the Quran. He was aware of an ancient faith or spirituality that was both thousands of years old and yet still immensely meaningful to and practiced by indigenous communities around the world. He was attracted to this old root of human consciousness because it had no priests or churches or written scriptures, and yet it had survived centuries of persecution and genocide and continued to provide hope and meaning to its adherents. And he liked in particular the way that the indigenous worldview regarded everything on earth as being connected. Lawrence was seeking new identities in New Mexico, including a new form of religion. He was brought up a Christian and became disaffected with conventional belief and practice. He sought out and was affected by native religious ritual. Finding the appropriate ways in which to apprehend such ritual and incorporate its spiritual teachings was something that he set out deliberately to achieve. In his essays on the Indians, Lawrence tried to get down to the root of Indian culture. He attempted only to register the culture, not to idealize or to denigrate it. He sought an appropriate distance between self and other, warning against the Indians becoming like the white or the white taking on the ways of the Indian. Sitting with Indians around a campfire, listening to their singing and joining in their dancing made him realize that he preferred the animistic vision, as he put it, to monotheism. In a letter to Rolf Gardner, he said that he preferred the pagan many gods. And to Middleton Murray, he wrote, "This animistic religion is the only live one. Ours is a corpse of a religion." Lawrence understood that while he might become aware of a totally different way of looking at the world, he could not fully share in it because of the vast cultural differences between Indians and Englishmen. He could not imagine, he said, a common sympathy or understanding between himself as an Englishman tumbled out of the known world of the British Empire and the Indians. "Don't let me for a moment pretend to know anything," he said. "I know less than nothing." But unlike most white people at this time, he was willing to acknowledge that Western civilization did not have the answer to everything in the world, and that there was much that could be learned from the Indians. Lawrence knew that he could never become indigenous, but he could imagine, perhaps, what it might be like to see the world through the eyes of the Indian. In Indians and Entertainment, he said, to pretend to express one stream of consciousness in terms of another, so as to identify the two, is false and sentimental. The only way you can do it is to have a little ghost inside you, which sees both ways, or even many ways. He made a similar point in Pan in America. "So much depends," he said, "on one's attitude. One can shut many, many doors of receptivity in oneself, or one can open many doors that are shut." In Certain Americans and an Englishman, Lawrence suggested that instead of, or as well as, looking at the world from a Western perspective, let us try to adjust ourselves again to the Indian outlook, to take up an old dark thread from their vision, and see again as they see, without forgetting we are ourselves. So these notions that Lawrence had of seeing both ways, of many ways, of opening many doors, and of seeing as they see, are central to the indigenous concept of two-eyed seeing, which weaves together mainstream white Western knowledge systems with indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge. According to Albert Marshall, an indigenous Mi'kmaq leader in Nova Scotia, Canada, he said, possessing knowledge which is traditional or tribal is a mirror image of your own spirituality. There is nothing that we cannot understand this way. Science can explain many things, but in the tribal world, there is another realm. Yet we value knowledge and we combine it with assistance we seek from the spirit world. One should not be afraid to seek assistance to develop it, to develop a thought. In our world, you are a physical being and you are a spiritual being. Two-eyed seeing is practiced by bringing our knowledges together and being able to put our values and actions and knowledge in front of us like an object for examination and discussion. By talking and walking together, it is possible to weave back and forth between our worldviews. Marshall notes the tendency for the mainstream to assign indigenous knowledge holders as a role akin to Hollywood Indians, whereby someone else writes your script or relegates you to entertainment status. This explains why some Native Americans just make it up, particularly when there is payment for services. In Indians and entertainment, Lawrence also makes the distinction between Indian ceremonies that are viewed as entertainment by the white audience and as sacred knowledge by the indigenous practitioners. Two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspective treasured by many Aboriginal peoples that refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and to using both those eyes together for the benefit of all. Two-eyed seeing enables recognition of indigenous traditional knowledge as a distinct and whole knowledge system, side by side with and equivalent to mainstream white Western knowledge. It is possible to weave back and forth between these knowledges because in any particular situation, it may be that one has more applicable strengths than the other. Yet with changing circumstances, this can easily switch. Indigenous traditional knowledge was never meant to be static and stay in the past. Rather, it must be brought into the present to make it meaningful in our lives and in our communities. Indigenous traditional knowledge exists at a number of levels: physical knowledge, personal connection, respect, and sacred knowledge. Mainstream knowledge can relate to the first of these levels because it is based on empirical evidence. The next two levels can also be understood by mainstream knowledge. The highest level, however, sacred knowledge, can only be truly understood within the language of the particular indigenous peoples. It is not possible to translate this knowledge into another language. This ensures that indigenous traditional knowledge cannot be stolen or appropriated. Knowledge is spirit, not a property or commodity. The identity of the practitioners, informants, and the community should always be fully referenced and acknowledged because some aspects of understanding can and do vary among individuals and communities, given the interconnectedness of land, language, and people. The importance of the particular traditionally occupied ecosystem, the land, must be recognized because there exists an ecology of the sacred among the human and more than human consciousness in a particular territory. Lawrence can relate to indigenous traditional knowledge on the first three levels, but he can only imagine the fourth and highest level. Sacred knowledge, the indigenous religion or belief system, can only be known and practiced by indigenous people. As Lawrence put it, the life of the Indian, his stream of conscious being, is just death to the white man. And we can understand the consciousness of the Indian only in terms of the death of our consciousness. To pretend to express one's stream of consciousness in terms of another, so as to identify the two, is false and sentimental. However, this does not preclude Lawrence from trying to look at the world from more than one perspective. The only way you can do it is to have a little ghost inside you, he said, which sees both ways, or even many ways. According to Marshall, two-eyed seeing is about using all our understandings, Western and Indigenous, so we can leave the world a better place. It is about life, what you do, what kind of responsibilities you have, how you should live while on earth. The advantage of two-eyed seeing is that you are always fine-tuning your mind into different places at once. You are always looking for another perspective and better way of doing things. The preservation of Indigenous language and culture is imperative. When you force people to abandon their ways of knowing, their ways of seeing the world, you literally destroy their spirits. And once that spirit is destroyed, it is very, very difficult to embrace anything, because that person is never complete. To create a complete picture of a person, their spirit, their physical being, their emotions, and their intellectual being all have to be intact and work in a very harmonious way. In explaining two-eyed seeing, Marshall uses the image of two eyes positioned behind two connected pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. This image emphasizes that Mi'kmaq understandings, or Anishinaabe or any other Indigenous group, are but one view in a multitude of Indigenous views. And similarly, that all of the world's cultures have understandings to contribute. Thus, one might talk about four-eyed seeing or 10-eyed seeing. In addition, the two jigsaw puzzle pieces help remind us that, with respect to traditional knowledge, no one person ever has more than one small piece of the knowledge. This knowledge draws upon the community of elders and other knowledge holders, as well as the collective consciousness of the people. So here too, one might wish to talk about multiple-eyed seeing, or, as Lawrence put it, so much depends on one's attitude. One can shut many, many doors of receptivity in oneself, or one can open many doors that are shut. If traditional knowledge is to be regarded as authentic, it must be validated by community elders and knowledge holders. This knowledge is collective because while some individuals may have expertise in certain subjects, none of us knows everything. It is particularly important to nourish the living relationships within traditional knowledge. We need to recognize that stories, songs, crafts, practices, family, community, language, ceremonies, and connectivity with the land are important in the transmission of traditional knowledge. It is not a book-based process of learning. It is living knowledge that is acquired over the whole of a person's life journey. Two-eyed seeing challenges the predominant and implicit conceptualizations of the relationships between humans and their natural, social, and created environments, which remain grounded in Cartesian ontology, wherein humanity is not seen as an implicit part of biodiversity, embedded in a vast web of mutual and symbiotic interactions. The mainstream discourse about the natural world favours metaphors that represent a language of containment and separation, whereas Indigenous stories collapse the distance between human and animal. The white Western perspective tends to overlook our interrelations within the web of life. Two-eyed seeing will require exploring or undertaking decolonizing work if intercultural and Indigenous approaches to radical human ecology are to be developed. Lawrence was the only major English writer who was able to imagine how the colonized are bound to react against the decolonizer and what may be psychologically necessary for them to decolonize themselves. Lawrence gained some insight into Indigenous traditional knowledge through his attendance at sacred ceremonies such as the dance of the sprouting corn and the Hopi snake dance, which he described in Mornings in Mexico. Lawrence tried to view these ceremonies through his white Western eye as spectacle, performance, entertainment, circus, pantomime even, and through his imagined Indigenous eye as ancient, traditional, religious, sacred practices. In other words, he viewed them from both a colonial and a decolonial perspective. In doing so, he was trying to follow his own advice. Let us try to adjust ourselves again to the Indian outlook, he said, to take up an old dark thread from their vision and see again as they see without forgetting we are ourselves. Thank you.
So, if we were reading T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Thomas Merton, G.K. Chesterton, even John Betjeman, we would expect to get some direct, if you like, religious kick out of the content to reflect on, to nourish our quest. But with D.H. Lawrence, is he really the first one that we would turn to get this direct spiritual guidance? For often it's so hidden, particularly in his novels. Hearing these last two talks, I feel it's quite obvious that Lawrence was a spiritual person, and his religious background, observations, journeys, pervade so much of his writings. It's all there. You will not have to strive to find a church setting, for example, a wedding, an architectural description, a liturgical observation, and even mystical words about a cathedral. And not only Christian, but rituals from other faiths, which we've been hearing from John. And then there's the preaching, the dogma, the bespoke Lawrencian theology, his human interpretation and identification of so many biblical characters, most of all Jesus, who of course in many ways he likens himself to. We'll come to that in a bit. And then all those questions upsetting the apple cart in the novels, in the essays, and there's the poetry, and especially the late poetry, when he is clearly now on a different aspect of his journey. We heard a little bit from Tony, and I'm going to develop that further later. So I'd like to make possibly 4 observations through all this. My first one, I want to look back again at Lawrence's own religious background, which Tony spoke about earlier. Brought up in a religious household in a puritanical mining town where just about everyone believed in God, but in a very strict, uncompromising way. At least that would apply to many of the mining families, many who would attend the very rule-making, strict, pious, God-fearing, primitive Methodist church. And there was one just down the road, built entirely by the miners, a few streets away from where Lawrence was born. Most Eastward folk would attend chapel and have this dutiful allegiance to a very strict religion. But Lawrence's mother and himself worshipped at the Congregational Church, the Congo Chapel, which, thanks to the intellectual and influential Robert Reed, which again Tony spoke about, he was much more liberal, and that was a much more liberal church community. The strict interpretation and adherence to the Bible would be now challenged, even in a strict Eastward puritanical society, which was all around here. Here, as well as having a background in solid Christian theology, and there's no doubt that Lawrence knew his Bible inside out, he, along with his soulmate Jesse Chambers, supported by the Reverend Reed, must have engaged in all sorts of theological discussions and questions and maybe a few answers. And then Lawrence and Jesse, helped by the adjoining institute, the Literary Society, would be reading books by contemporary commentators and critics of the time. And so he goes on his journey and then, of course, reaches this point where he has to renounce Christianity in its traditional form. He will now commence on a long, tortuous journey trying to find out who and what this so-called God was. Exist or not exist? Where does the psychic imagination come into play? And what are all these myths all about? And so forth. That leads me into my second point. As one travels through his writing, we realize that this God, with a capital G or a small g, is everywhere. Sometimes directly in essays, but most of the time he's buried in parables, character descriptions, dialogues, and buildings and landscapes in those novels. He personalized so much himself, and he became one of the biblical characters, which would then come out again in his writing. And just like he used actual events in his novels, he would also turn biblical characters, biblical phrases, to mold into his own texts and descriptions. He would describe church buildings, biblical stories, church communities, characters, even an unruly choir, into his own stories, often to a lot of critique as well. The rainbow is often referred to as Lawrence's Bible, followed by Women in Love. And one has only got to look at characters such as Will Brangwen, and then of course Birkin, to see so many similarities and connections and perceptions of this very subject, and the struggle that Lawrence was going in when he couldn't identify the fact that there was a God there and there was all this suffering down here. All these dichotomies rolling all around. And this is where we see Lawrence as a preacher. He time from time would use religious archaic phrases as if we were in the authorized version of the Bible. And then his observations, his challenges become these parables, just as Jesus would have been constantly in the New Testament Gospels. Lawrence, of course, was branded as a heretic. There's no doubt about that. And he suffered tortuous rebuke, both in real life and his own fictional characters, like, again, Birkin. And again, this is no different to Christ. Christ challenged. Christ came out with all sorts of incredibly controversial things. In fact, Lawrence saw Christ as this complex and outpouring human person. And Lawrence rebelled against all the immense godliness ascribed to Christ, so therefore shunning all the essential, deep, profound doctrines of Christianity, the very heart of Christianity. And this was dangerous, highly, highly dangerous. But his concern for the overwhelming humanness, the costly humanness of Christ, was so important to Lawrence that it overtook this spiritual incarnation of the God side. Thus he would lose his faith underpinned with Christian faith and question it all. And of course, to a faith person, this is highly disturbing. But I want to ask, isn't that where he will speak to us? Let's be honest. Unless we are superficially arrogant with pious overtones, our own belief or unbelief is challenged almost on a daily basis. We ask ourselves, is this all supernatural? And as we live in this very complex world, which we referred to earlier on, where there's so much hate and division, misunderstandings, political, cultural diversities, wars, striving for peace, we do say, where is God? Where's God amongst all this? So, for example, to look at the humanness of Jesus, look at him as a man, that's what Lawrence is asking us to do. Lawrence may come out without really extreme things and at the peril. But that's surely what we should be doing as well. And then if we are faith people, it may go stronger. And if we're not, we'll think, no, that doesn't make sense to me. I think there's a lot about Lawrence and his careful perception and analysis of the suffering Christ and the life of Christ and that journey that we symbolically think of between Christmas and Easter. And also there's the resurrection, and Lawrence wrote a complete essay all about that as well, which is very interesting reading. So all along the line he challenges us to think, to question. He challenges himself too. And just like with politics that we studied a few weeks ago, he would change course, and he'd even negate what went before. An enigmatic figure. But isn't that what life is all about? Point 3. As he renounced Christianity, more and more he explored these other faiths, ancient rituals, pagan mythology, and a lot of the spirituality which John spoke about. And surely, in this complex global world of multi-faiths, it's important that we perceive more, this open door you referred to look at what is going on around. And as regards ritual, let's be honest, we love ritual. A lot of Christian liturgy has strong pagan origins. The artistic side of us loves the theatre, films, even pomp and circumstance. And faith believes love to put into perspective through the Christian Eucharist, which is a drama in itself. Or we go to the other side, to the Native American ritual, dance, sacrifices, etc. And as we look around the world at the great religions of Hindu, Buddhism, and even the ancient Aborigines and so forth, the ritual is there, and it's a tool to both celebrate on earth, but also perhaps to get the glimpse of that beyond here. And the wonderful poems, readings, songs, all embracing this concept. And so I move to my fourth and final point, and that is something I alluded to in the advanced publicity which you have in front of you. And that's my own quote, Lawrence was searching for something beyond that ultimate oblivion that he frequently refers to in his late poems. Here we see a dying man ridden with advanced tuberculosis, searching for that mystical voice, that experience of transcendence out of this world of turmoil and suffering into some new territory out there, incomprehensible, invisible, but something there does exist. And that word oblivion, which I'm hoping we might sort of have a discussion on that, maybe, but that crops up frequently in those late poems. Gone is the youthful, argumentative, controversial, perhaps at times arrogant Lawrence. He stopped identifying himself as a Jesus preacher, a figure setting the cat among the pigeons, if you like, turning everything upside down. Now he concentrates on God. Initially God with a small g, and then towards the end, God with a capital G. He always had a gift of beautiful descriptive writing. You've only got to go right back to the White Peacock and those wonderful description of the plants, which of course Ruth has introduced us to in the past. And of course the biblical terminology throughout the rainbow, women in love, Lady Chatterley, it's all there. In the late poems where the mystical, profound language may be found. And to me, it's my personal point of view, but I believe this is the ultimate of mysticism, to try and encounter and unite with that God. Tony quoted from one of those beautiful poems. I'd like to just follow up with a couple of other short ones, and I think almost they lead on from that, because I think he's got a little bit further or nearer to this God, this oblivion. So I'm just going to read them one after the other. They're very short. To be able to forget is to be able to yield to God who dwells in deep oblivion. Only in sheer oblivion are we with God, and that's with a capital G. For when we know in full, we have left off knowing. Man knows nothing till he knows how not to know. And the greatest of teachers will tell you the end of all knowledge is oblivion, sweet, dark oblivion. And when I cease, even from myself, and am consummated. Oh, what we want on earth is centres here and there of silence and forgetting, where we may cease from knowing, and as far as we know, may cease from being in the sweet wholeness of oblivion. And so, to my conclusion. You will have the facts, the quotes, the references throughout this last hour. But what I feel is that there's so much to think about, argue about in oneself. The biblical, the theological, the philosophical knowledge of Lawrence that he shares with us. Wow, it's great as well. The questioning he does time and time again, throwing us all into turmoil. The humanness of suffering and misunderstanding seen through Lawrence's Christ-like eyes. And then finally, the mystical union with a loving and embracing God that Lawrence reaches out to as he prepares for his next journey into oblivion. All this makes me say, yes, Lawrence was a spiritual person. He needs a spiritual guide, and he inspires me, even if his words are not obvious, his thoughts easily misunderstood, realizing provocation, hurt, pain, and his words are so complex and even confusing. But my, oh my, as one delves more into his output, we are drawn into something far beyond our own comprehension. And we're invited to think, question, here on earth and beyond, and to say to those of us who have faith, maybe to contemplation, to prayer. I'd like to sum all this up with a quotation I heard once from Catherine Brown, who also quoted Terry Eagleton. Listen to this. Lawrence manages to communicate a richer sense of God than almost any other 20th century author. Well, it makes you think, doesn't it? Thank you. Tony and John.